Chair of the California Energy Commission, Jan Mazurek, Director of Climate Works Carbon Dioxide Removal Fund, Andrew Beebe, Managing Director at Obvious Ventures, and Carl Page, co-founder and president of the Anthropocene Institute. Now, before we hear from our distinguished panelists, let me direct your attention to the Q&A button at the bottom. It's got a 1 on it, now 2. We'd like to encourage you to submit your questions for the panelists, as well as also vote up and down the questions that have already been submitted. So in the course of the conversation, please take a moment to turn to that. So let's begin with Carl Page. Mr. Page founded eGroups and worked for several software and hardware companies. eGroups was acquired by Yahoo, and his experience includes working both with startups and multinationals. Now, Carl, you've often said that achieving net zero won't be enough, and we must be prepared to restore the climate. What actions do you believe a Biden administration should take in terms of, well, beyond drastically cutting greenhouse gas emissions, for example?
Yeah, well, thanks, Grant. I guess I'm just very happy to welcome everyone to the Climate Restoration and Energy Policy in a Biden administration thought process. And at the Anthropocene Institute, we try to be a clearinghouse for good ideas about how to get our planet stable again. I work with entrepreneurs to solve problems relevant to climate change. And as a computer engineer, I've been thinking about how to apply technology and get innovation to reach the marketplace. The goal really can't be zero emissions at any time. You know, as a creative exercise, it's wise to think about what Buckminster Fuller taught us. We're on a spaceship, Earth. We're on a sun cruise together. We're all in it together. We're going to be heading around for, and we need to make sure all of our fuel supply and our materials are ready. We have our life support systems providing fresh air and water, and we need an engineering team to accomplish that goal. And that engineering team needs to use science and proper resources, and it can't be afraid to make changes just because we don't know quite where we're going. Most folks are saying, hey, we're heading towards catastrophic climate change. Let's slow down. And that's all of our instincts when we're in danger. But if you're on a spaceship going around the sun and you slow down, what happens is you plummet into the star. We actually need to speed up and change course and head towards safe, clean energy. And we're not going to get there if we follow the instinct to try to return to some medieval technology or abandon progress. So what the Biden administration needs to do is make sure that we clean up pollution, first of all. And everybody focuses on greenhouse gas pollution, and that is an existential threat to humanity. But it's really hard to explain greenhouse gases to the average person, because to understand it, you need a computer and millions of data points and a whole calculus argument that stretches out into the future. And it's really easy for the foes of a response to cast doubt on all those complicated assumptions. So I focus on solving a different problem, which is easier to understand and unfortunately quicker, and that's ocean acidification. In 2035, the acid in the ocean will increase simply because we're putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And the only thing you need to understand is how you make sparkling water out of still water. And the ocean's plankton strongly prefers still water. And it doesn't know how to live with sparkling water at all. And it doesn't, and we can't predict what will happen. You know, if you take in a small aquarium and you let the water get high in CO2, all the fish will die and it will start to go eutrophic and it will start generating hydrogen sulfide instead of oxygen. But the planet is a lot more resilient than a tiny experiment that we can do. So nobody can say how the plankton will change its way of life in 2035. But don't bet your life on it continuing to make oxygen for us. So we need to change quickly to draw down the CO2 from our atmosphere and ocean for the simplest of reasons. There are other forms of pollution that we also need to clean up. The farm runoff of phosphorus and nitrogen are going to kill us if something else doesn't. And obviously, we've reduced the habitat for wild creatures way beyond the point that's stable. And we need to fix that. We need to reduce the litter and plastic that are going around the planet. We need to reduce the biohazards, the germs, the pandemics, the invasive species. And we need to deal with erosion, runoff from bad farming practices and bad construction processes. You know, we've lost 2,000 square miles of Louisiana alone in the last 100 years, and it's only accelerating. And so the good news is all these things are super easy to fix. We have the technology, and it's not even very expensive, but it seems that way now. And the reason we think it's expensive is because energy prices are high. We've gotten used to fossil fuel energy prices, and we were told that coal was the cheapest energy we'd ever see. Reality is engineers and scientists are ready to deliver energy cheaper. There's three kinds of people: some that say cheaper energy is inevitable, and some say it's impossible, and some say it's a bad idea. Now, the folks that say clean energy that's cheap is impossible, that's the fossil fuel industry, and they're worried that they'll be out of business. And I feel for them, and we actually do have to figure out how to keep the energy industry in business as energy gets cheaper. The folks that say it's inevitable are the folks that are watching solar and wind, because as wind and solar get down to the 2 and 3 cents prices now, predicting 1 cent 5 years from now is pretty obvious. And the folks that say it's a bad idea, those are the ones I have the biggest argument with. There's a lot of mainstream environmentalists who are worried that the habitat collapse, or the footprint pollution, humans taking too much space with sprawl, that'll get a lot worse if we make energy cheaper. And those environmentalists never studied biology. At least they never studied the biology of humans, because it turns out that when humans are middle class, we reduce our population growth. The problem where humans have to create lots of new people is when they are living in the subsistence farming or cottage industry lifestyle, and children are in the money, and people are poor enough that they desperately need more hands at that task. The moment people have choices brought about by a reasonable economy, they have a subsistence or a sustainable level of children. And so we need to end poverty before we can fix the other environmental problems. And unfortunately, environmentalists haven't always been championing that cause. That's got to change. The good news is, when we make clean energy cheaper, and this is probably the most important thing, cheaper clean energy makes clean energy cheaper. It's not a tautology, it's a virtuous circle. Cheaper clean energy makes clean energy cheaper. That's true because wind energy, nuclear energy, and solar energy are all capital intensive. It costs a lot to build them, but then they're operationally cheap. It costs nothing to operate them. So once you have a solar plant or a nuclear plant built, it lasts for decades without needing any fuel. And the beautiful thing is that it then costs less to build new nuclear, solar, or wind plants. So the price collapse continues. And that's one reason why we need to make sure our energy industry doesn't have to rely on stable prices to have a stable life. So that's an economic problem to solve, but it's easy to solve. But when we do that, we'll find that we can provide a great affluent lifestyle for 12 billion people on Earth. And the reason I say 12 billion is because I'm an engineer. And we know that if we make everyone middle class, Earth's population will stabilize at around 11 billion. And because I'm an engineer and I am responsible for a spaceship, I have to overplan a little bit. So I say 12 billion. But anyway, there's no resources on Earth that people need that are in short supply if energy is cheap. We can recycle everything. We have plenty of minerals, plenty of materials. We don't need to rely nearly as heavily on the biological world. There is no carrying capacity of planet Earth for human culture. That's a dangerous myth. We don't need to rely on our biosystems at all for human needs. We can decouple it as long as energy is reliable, cheap, and safe. So that's my message. Let's get there. The sub-goal, making energy 1 cent a kilowatt hour or less, and the goal, abundance and prosperity for all humanity with great human rights. The danger is we will try to protect old industry. We'll try to protect old jobs. The industry of the future doesn't have lobbyists. The industry of the past wants protection. It wants innovation-free zones. There's no interest from the political class in technological progress, but it's the only thing that increases our prosperity. You know, lawyers and bankers don't add anything to prosperity. Engineers create it all. And we spend almost 0% of our national GDP on engineering that could destabilize the incumbent players. So what we really need to do is make sure that, you know, we have two political parties. One protects the capital and executives of the old companies that are blocking progress, and the other protects the labor of the old companies that are blocking progress. What we need is politicians that are able to lead our way into letting new companies and new technologies proliferate.
Right.
That's my message.
Great. Thank you, Carl, for that uplifting message. And I think it works well to talk with Josh Freed. Josh, presidents typically come into office with a whole list of priorities and all kinds of distractions, and they're usually getting pulled in all kinds of different ways. During the campaign, President Biden said he wanted to be a climate president. What do you believe will be some of the most likely early actions a Biden administration will take?
Yeah, thank you, Grant, and thank you so much for having me here. So as a once aspiring historian and a longtime member of the political class, I'm going to take a step back and set the table here. As you mentioned, Grant, that President-elect Joe Biden did run on what was the most ambitious climate and clean energy agenda of any general election candidate in our nation's history. And we should take both the president-elect and his entire campaign at the word on this agenda. We also need to take a step back and remember that he's coming into office facing two likely sets of challenges. And they're two huge sets of challenges. First, the Biden administration will be wrestling with the greatest set of crises this country has faced since Franklin Roosevelt took office in 1933. And it's getting a raging pandemic that is only getting worse by the day, under control, while setting up a government that has been devastated by 4 years of malign neglect and worse, and responding to the greatest economic crisis since the Great Depression and climate change. That's an enormous amount on his plate. On top of that, he will likely, or at least potentially, be the first Democratic president to come into office since Grover Cleveland which is long before my time, to take office without a majority in both houses of Congress. So the deck couldn't be stacked higher in many ways for the president-elect and for the country come January 20th, 2021. So what should we expect? Look, just as the New Deal took on the crises that President Roosevelt faced simultaneously, we should think about President-elect Biden's approach in the same way. There isn't going to necessarily be a climate policy or an economic policy. He's not going to be the climate president. He is going to be the president of restoring and recovering for an America that has been gravely damaged over the last 4 years. And we're going to see climate and clean energy integrated across a whole set of actions to get our country back on its feet. And I think that, frankly, from a political economy, from a cultural and society perspective, that's a huge advantage for climate policy. And it's particularly important if the people on this call, on this Zoom, and we see both corporate America and labor and others all support that. So I'm going to just quickly roll over through the sort of three themes that we're likely to see, at least for the first year. The first is COVID. I don't need to get into details of how bad the current situation is, but talking to the public health and other professionals that we at Third Way work with, I think it's clearly as bad, if not worse, than the worst headlines right now. We have very encouraging news about vaccines, but that's still off several months in the future. And for all intents and purposes, until President-elect Biden takes the oath of office, we don't have a functioning federal government. And that's, as stark as it sounds, it's more stark than that. It's going to leave a huge hole to fill until the pandemic's under control. And we need to make sure, from a climate and clean energy advocacy perspective, that we are grounded in that reality, that anything that's talked about in that first period has to be talked about within the context of the first order crisis. Otherwise, we're going to look enormously out of touch. So the second part of it is the economy. And this is where climate and clean energy should and likely will live, particularly for the early part of the Biden administration. Our real unemployment rate is probably pushing around 20% right now, and maybe a lot higher than that. It's going to be higher than that by the time January 20 rolls around. And states and localities are struggling with enormous amounts of lost revenue and demand for relief that Congress is failing to provide. And so what we need to do is really contextualize clean energy in how it plays a big role in COVID stimulus, in recovery, in longer term investments, and in a way that gets done in building more clean energy infrastructure and investments in innovation across the entire country and into communities of color that have been excluded to date. That, look, we have been advocating for innovation for clean energy at Third Way for the entire 11 years that I've worked there. I think one thing that gets massively overlooked and left out is people. The technology, if you are worried about your job or don't have a job, if you live in Flint, Michigan, and you don't have clean water, if you aren't connected to high-speed internet because you live in rural America, the rest of it doesn't matter. If you're sitting at the kitchen table worried about what the future of your family looks like, the wonders of the technology or saving the climate don't matter. We've got to connect it back to people. And we're going to have to see how willing, if there is a Republican Senate, they are to put country over party. There is bipartisan support for significant spending on innovation, for tax credits and investment in incentives for existing renewables, for carbon capture, for direct air capture, advanced nuclear, energy storage, and electric vehicles, and probably hydrogen for heavy duty vehicles. Is that enough? No, but it's an enormously good start. And we're going to need companies and investors and innovators to really press the case and make sure that both sides of the aisle recognize that there's demand for this and there's an expectation that this is going to transcend the typical, what can I do to keep my party in power, that we've unfortunately gotten too used to in the last 4 years. And so that's sort of the setup. The last couple of things are, okay, so what can President Biden and his administration do immediately off the bat without having to worry about congressional action if there's a Republican in control of the Senate? And that will help with some of the context for accelerating innovation and addressing climate. I mean, they're going to rejoin the Paris Agreement. And that is important. It is mostly symbolic, but it is a signal to global leaders that the United States is back and engaged in the conversation around climate and clean energy and setting a moral standard and leadership that we just haven't had the last 4 years. We're going to be able to convene those leaders and engage in what do we as a community of nations do to move forward, to start addressing emissions, and also create more markets for this. We can reverse the Trump era energy and climate rollbacks and empower states like California to push the rest of the country ahead on things like zero emissions vehicles, and get a national policy that helps accelerate the embrace of innovation, which is really important. We'll see some other executive actions, financial regulations that help encourage clear transparency on where the climate risks are and where climate actions are, and a much deeper embrace of environmental justice, which hasn't been a big part of the national conversation until very recently. The final thing, and I'll turn it over to the rest of the group and really look forward to the conversation here, is that we're already beginning to see very serious, experienced, and thoughtful people named to what the Biden White House will be. We're going to see that take shape even further in the pre-Thanksgiving days, likely around who the senior leadership of the president-elect's economic team and national security team are going to be. Soon thereafter, I expect you'll see the same around energy and climate. And these are people, for a change, very different from the previous 4 years, who understand innovation, who understand markets in the economy, and who understand people. And you know, I wish I didn't have to say this and it didn't sound partisan, but you know, there is a grounding of the government being here to serve the people and serve the common good that really was lost over the last 4 years. And seeing that restored is a much, much more important part of seeing clean energy innovation start to roll forward, to see climate action start to roll forward, than I think was really potentially appreciated when we had the Obama era, when we had a Congress, even under the George W. Bush era, that was willing to look a little bit more at climate and clean energy solutions, certainly, than we got the last 4 years. So there's an enormous amount to do. And I think grounding conversations like this in that acknowledgement becomes an important first step.
Great. Thanks for those encouraging words, Josh. Now I want to ask Nneka Uzo, as somebody in the forefront of building a cleaner and more equitable world at the Elemental Accelerator, how do you think the Biden administration will impact the change makers and the climate entrepreneurs that you guys work with?
Yeah, totally. I feel like there's probably 2 or 3 strong ways where a new administration can make impact. When I think about impact, there's so many ways to solve a problem. My focus area is in energy, but I truly believe that our solution is a holistic one for climate change. So it's energy, water, mobility, agriculture, circular economy, et cetera. But it's really thinking about how do we use our standards and rules to support the people who live in the climate. Sometimes when you hear words like climate restoration, it's really easy to think about the stratosphere, think about ozone and beyond. But in reality, the climates that most of us live in, our communities, are places where we have friends, family, some that we might not be able to see. But what is the technology, or what are the rules and changes that you can make at the federal level that can affect the lives of everyday people? So right off the bat, the first thing I think about are things like emissions rules, all the things that the EPA has rolled back in the last few years. 77,000 children miss school a day due to asthma, and a lot of that's related to pollution. So there's direct ways to tie some of these regulations with costs to the education system or costs to the medical system. There's a famous saying that every company is a software company, but in my mind, I think every company is going to be a climate company. because there's not necessarily an opportunity for new companies to come about and create more ecological disaster. Even companies that used to be known for spewing smoke, like Hummer, are coming out with new EV Hummer trucks. You know, like it's a new day and it's a new age. And I think the new administration is really thinking about how do we take that from a regulatory perspective. I think the second way where we can think about where the federal government can make a change is deploying catalytic funding. Right now, we have a variety of national labs. We have things like the National Science Foundation. We have NREL. All of these different organizations operate in their own silos, some for positive reasons, some just because of the way that they were designed. But how can we ensure that for startups and other organizations that are trying to do more innovation, that they can get access to that funding and those grants in a way that's prohibitive? I don't know if any of you have taken a look at some of these grants, but they're pages long, and oftentimes people have to hire consultants to help them in the process. That also is cost prohibitive. It makes you wonder, who is innovation for? Is it only for a select class of people who have the resources to do it? Or is it for anyone who has a dream and a good idea and ready to execute? Thirdly, I think that the opportunity for this administration as well to support innovation as it relates to climate tech is thinking about how do you incentivize large organizations and industrials to participate in this kind of design economy or this innovation economy. When we talk about design thinking and startups, there's this glee around learning what doesn't work, but you can't operate that way when you are government, and you can't fail big and fail fast when you're a utility company. So what are the opportunities for the government to come in to have some backstops, to offer some special programs, to think about new structures for how to do smart cities? How can we support our industrial and manufacturing communities in order for them to be able to work with startups or work with new technologies without fear of falling under?
Great. Well, that's, again, encouraging news. And I think it's interesting to see if the administration is going to have a new take in terms of how it reorganizes or organizes all of the various grant making that's directed around innovation. Speaking of that, David Hochschild, as chairman of the Golden State's Primary Energy Policy and Planning Agency, could you speak on how or about how a Biden administration will impact our state's drive to create a mostly carbon-free energy economy that will help essentially power the world's fifth largest economy? David?
Well, thanks, Grant, and good afternoon, everybody. Yeah, so first of all, I just think we have to acknowledge this was a Category 5 presidency, totally unprecedented. The scale, the challenge that Biden and Harris are going to have is colossal, because Trump has put in all these people running these agencies who are trying to dismantle and undermine the very purpose of the agencies, from EPA to Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, Department of Labor, and all the way down. There's a lot of repair work to do. I would just say, before we even get into these issues, I think the number one concern that we have to address collectively as Americans is returning our country to a state of fidelity to truth. It's very difficult to solve any problem, whether it's a pandemic or climate change, when we've lost fidelity to truth. And you see the consequences, obviously, with the pandemic now, us ignoring very clear, sound science, and we have 250,000 people who've died here, worse than anywhere else in the world. I think that's one of the things Biden's got to do, is take that example and really apply it to the climate threat, because there's clearly a lesson for us there. Having said that, I think there's a lot that a president can do even without the Senate. And I do think what's happening in California is a postcard from the future. Just as an example, 2 years ago, we signed into law the 100% clean energy mandate for our electric grid. And really, what you're seeing happening across the country, the electric grid itself is really ascendant as a climate solution. And everything's running through that: clean energy, electric vehicles, energy storage, rail, so forth. That was 2 years ago. So now we have 17 states that have adopted 100% clean energy mandates, plus DC and Puerto Rico. And the 100% mandate for the grid is in Biden's energy platform. So, we're in a moment where things can move very quickly from mythology to mainstream. And I think the same thing is happening now around equity. One of the principal strategies of California's climate approach now is to focus on equity as we lift up, these climate solutions. So for us at the Energy Commission, we just approved last month another $384 million for our clean transportation investment plan for EV charging. So 50% of that money is going to go into low-income and disadvantaged communities. We fund $150 million a year for clean energy research and development. We're doing 65% of those investments for the clean energy demonstration projects, energy storage, microgrids, things like that, into low-income disadvantaged communities, including tribes and so forth. And I think that is the template for the future for how we scale these solutions. I think the most dynamic opportunity may be around electric transportation. What has happened is EVs have really followed the cost trend we've seen with solar and wind. And obviously the batteries, 50%, the battery pack's 50% of the cost of the vehicles. Batteries have come down 90% in cost in the last 10 years. For us in California, we now have 750,000 electric vehicles that have been bought and are on the road. And electric vehicles are our #1 export from the state. We got 34 companies manufacturing EVs in California, not just Tesla, which is now the most valuable car company in the world, but also bus companies like BYD and Proterra. And that has a huge benefit, not just for climate, because that's half of our greenhouse gas emissions, but really for health as well. And the disadvantaged communities that have to live next to freeways and so forth. And that has a potential to scale really quickly. And I think when you think about what Josh was mentioning earlier about the need to deal with the economic recovery, there's a lot of investment that can happen to put people to work right away, building out EV charging infrastructure, that kind of thing. And the federal government can lead by example. Procurement from the federal government for the military, for all these, federal government is one of the biggest customers in the country, can lead by example. And I think that's a very powerful thing, as well as really apply the power of regulation to advance these goals. And then we'll get the volume. And what happens is, and this is what happened in solar and wind, is you get enough push from procurement and enough pull that you actually get to scale and the costs come down. And now solar and wind are off and running. They're the two cheapest resources you can buy for electricity. And that same possibility is there for electric vehicles. So I think federal leadership on that could do a lot of good in the next couple of years.
Great. Thanks, David. Jan Mazurek. Jan, I want to turn to you because maybe we can talk a little bit about what climate scientists have been saying that the 1920s, the 2020s could be a make or break decade for humanity in terms of having any chance of avoiding the worst effects of a warming planet. As someone who's closely studied and worked on carbon removal for many years now, what do you see a Biden administration being able to achieve with or without a divided Congress? I mean, I don't know if you want to get into the context and also the COVID context, but curious your thoughts.
Yeah, thanks for the question, and thanks everyone for joining this afternoon. And apologies in advance. The panel has done a masterful job of going from high to low, and I'm going to get a bit granular and also a little bit remedial for those of you who haven't spent a lot of time on the carbon removal agenda. And as to what the Biden administration might do, I just want to be clear that ClimateWorks Foundation is a nonprofit, nonpartisan C3. So these are my own views, but let me start with a little bit of context setting. So most of you know we have about 1 trillion excess tons of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere already. And as we all saw, even during the worst portions of lockdown where there was very little business as usual emissions, the planet continued to warm. Atmospheric concentrations of CO2, which are pretty dilute, continued to climb. So that will continue regardless of what happens on the mitigation or avoided emissions front. And we have that excess CO2 in the atmosphere because of inaction. And I'm just as responsible for that as anyone else. I was implementing Kyoto through the back door about 30 years ago when I was still at EPA, and look where it's gotten us. So to stay within the Paris commitments of 1.5 degree keeping warming at no more than 1.5 degrees, we have to take emissions all the way to zero. But then we also have to remove 10 gigatons of historic emissions from the atmosphere no later than 30 years from now. So 10 gigatons per year. What's a gigaton? It's the equivalent of about 160 Hoover dams. So we're talking about a lot of material that, although there's twice as much up there now as during pre-industrial levels, it's very dilute, it's very complicated to remove and costly. But fortunately, we have a broad array of natural and land sparing and potentially even ocean-based removal approaches at hand from which we can draw. So the land and oceans each remove and store about 30% of human-made emissions. So they're very effective at that, but as we increase CO2 in the atmosphere, they're becoming less and less effective sinks, and some are even starting to experience feedbacks, as we're seeing here in California. The forests are burning at a rate that we in the modeling community hadn't even anticipated to happen until at least 30 years from now. So it's going to get harder and harder to lean on our terrestrial sinks as the climate signal gets more loud. So we need to start now on low cost reforestation and afforestation solutions. And then we need to start scaling big filters that run on excess wind and solar to start pulling that historic CO2 down from the atmosphere. Those are land sparing devices. It's a very old technology that is used in scuba and is imperative in space missions to keep humans and other living things alive and remove CO2. So it's a pretty low tech, and it already exists in many places, in several places in the world at pilot scale. So as we remove CO2 with forests and with machines that mimic trees, sadly, the ocean that is already taking up excess CO2 and is starting to acidify is going to give some of that excess CO2 back. I'm sorry to be a Debbie Downer. Today's panel theme sounds pretty heavy, but we need to understand those complex carbon fluxes. Fortunately, ocean forests, i.e. kelp, don't have the same constraints as land-based forests, which when you try to expand them, they tend to bump into farmland. And as we're already seeing in places such as Wales, where we're trying to reforest, the farmers are getting pretty irritated. And I know from experience that Brazil is not keen on behaving as a global sink for the world either, and surrendering indigenous and farming lands for those purposes. So we're already starting to provide funding for some grantees to explore how accelerating the planet's natural erosion processes can help to buffer seawater and store more CO2. We already know that oyster hatcheries have to buffer their water to bring shells to maturity. The water is otherwise too acidic for them to grow. And in theory, ocean alkalinity enhancement can remove at least 12 gigatons of CO2 per year. In practice, it will probably be something more like 2 gigatons a year at around the same cost of other removal options. And so to help build federal ambition for that, ClimateWorks just funded earlier this year a National Academy's Ocean Carbon Removal Study. We hope that study will help to educate decision makers in the legislative and executive branches and accordingly increase appropriations ambition, make funds flow to early stage research to help us understand the risks and benefits of these approaches. Next month, former Energy Secretary Moniz is also releasing a report that includes a chapter on ocean carbon dioxide removal. That'll be very important to take to the Hill and to the newly installed cabinet secretaries for briefings. So, our experience at ClimateWorks is that although carbon dioxide removal is a relatively novel area, sort of originating as a sort of grant-making portfolio around the time of Paris. North America and the UK in particular have already been leaders in this. We think that's a great thing because we can buy down the cost of carbon dioxide removal and deploy that at very low cost to other parts of the world. Our grantees, even under the most challenging of circumstances over the last several years, have already secured about $100 million in federal appropriations to flow to research and early stage technology and deployment. And they're poised to secure hundreds of millions more in appropriations. Our grantees, even under the most challenging of circumstances, already passed a tax credit that brings down the cost of removing carbon dioxide from the air. It's called 45Q. And California, as we know, under the sort of visionary leadership of Chair Nichols, has a low carbon fuel standard that further brings down the cost of removing carbon from the air. So when you stack those two things, that brings down the cost of carbon dioxide removal from about $600 a ton to $100 a ton. It starts to get competitive with any number of approaches, particularly when one applies the new levelized cost metrics that have been developed at Columbia University. So in the case of a divided Congress, we'll have to work around the margins, but as I've just attempted to demonstrate, we know that carbon dioxide removal has broad bipartisan appeal. We've already had a number of narrow and targeted wins. And so to echo Josh's point, this is not going to be easy. This is not going to be a centerpiece priority, but we can expect to make incremental progress on expanding 45Q, working around the margins with additional tax incentives on the assumption that tax reform may be an early priority of a Biden administration. To the point on procurement, ClimateWorks helped to enshrine the Buy Clean program here in California for procuring California-made clean cement. And we have also recently helped to enshrine similar procurement incentives in Congress, such as the Sea Fuels Act, which helps the military procure direct air capture for jet and shipping fuels. That helps military field readiness, not having to rely on fossil fuels that are taken out of the ground. And the beauty of all of this is obviously the political economy. We can pay oil workers to take carbon out of the air and put it back in the ground or recycle it into jet fuel, as opposed to taking new fossil out of the ground. We can keep it in the ground, but we can also keep people employed, which is an incredibly powerful narrative. If we go down the infrastructure route, we would expect to have some narrow targeted wins around using clean building materials such as mass timber that uses small, uneconomic diameter trees that cause these catastrophic mass canopy fires here in California. It's a super strong building material. It's been pioneered in Europe. Governor Inslee has built 2 mass timber facilities in his state already, and they displace heavily polluting greenhouse gas emitting cement and steel, which is very difficult to decarbonize. So, and then finally, one of the areas where we see potential strong bipartisan agreement is around a sort of tree and natural carbon capture agenda. We're funding a rural resilience task force that is focused in particular on bringing in voices that we previously have not incorporated to the extent that we should have. So a strong focus on Indigenous tribal communities, as well as historically underrepresented Black farmers that USDA has heretofore not done a great job of representing in their efforts. And we're very excited about the potential appointees that could be going in and leading some of these programs on the technological and natural side. And so in conclusion, I think there will be some limited and targeted potential areas of slipping carbon dioxide removal through on the Hill in the same way that we've seen under the status quo situation. But I'm also super excited about executive branch action. There are so many carbon dioxide removal approaches. They span the federal family. They won't live in one particular agency. So we do have a legislative proposal known as the CREATE Act that would create a leadership function to coordinate all of that across the federal government, ideally at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. But I would also expect that we may see an executive order that mirrors the CREATE Act that would create that consolidated function. But as somebody who's been working on this topic for about 30 years, I will say that I cynically believe there's no substitute for a firm carbon law in Congress. But after 30 years of trying to create one, I've given up hope of that happening. So I think we have to continue to look for these small surgical strikes that add up to big wins. So.
Great. Thanks, Jan.
Yep.
I think, you know, the idea that there may be a cabinet level climate position may well be, or a dedicated climate position at a cabinet level could be quite significant in terms of driving a lot of the things that you just talked about. Andrea Beebe, I want to kind of turn it over to you. And, you know, a lot of people, as we've talked here today, and a lot of other folks have said, certainly throughout the campaign, that presidential leadership matters. Where do you see presidential leadership, and in particular a Biden administration, enhancing a lot of the different climate venture-oriented investment opportunities that you and your colleagues in the venture capital community are considering?
Thanks, Grant. Thanks for having me. This has been a great panel. I also want to thank Carl for not including venture capitalists in his joke about lawyers and bankers adding absolutely no value. So thank you for that. Grant, thank you for being able to pronounce these deceptively complex names around the panel. That was super impressive. BB is not often pronounced correctly during these events. And I also want to thank all of my fellow panelists for being the sort of, like, if anyone watched Game of Thrones, like the Night's Watch at Castle Black, who has been watching on the wall and defending us for all of these years. The last 4 years have been a dark period, and there's been a little bit of a dark cloud over a lot of people's climate ambitions. And yet, around the country, and of course around the world, we've seen extraordinary leadership and grassroots efforts who have really sort of come together to carry the torch, as it were, or the LED, or whatever it is that we carry. We organized a bunch of, probably everyone on this call and a lot of people in the audience organized Clean Energy for Biden in an effort to get grassroots volunteers to help out on the campaign and raise a lot of money. I had done this previously for Clinton, and then a long time ago for Obama. We had moderate success in those two previous campaigns, and this one, in a matter of 3 months, 11,000 people around the country signed up to volunteer, and those were just the people that signed up. We raised over $3 million for the campaign, and that's important because I think it helped with the election, but it's also important because it just shows the strength of numbers of people who have been caring about this issue in ever increasing numbers around the country. So I hope that I can share a little bit of optimism in the sense that we have been at this for a long, long time, and it's been working despite what's happened in Washington. You know, the last 4 years, here's another TV reference, but I'm clearly COVID watching too much cable television, but The Undoing, I don't know if anyone saw this on HBO. It's a great show with Nicole Kidman, but it also reminded me a lot of, you know, what the last 4 years has been about at an administrative level. Trump and team have, on a lot of climate and a lot of things, tried to undo a lot of the past work and the foundations that have been set up. It's been sort of creepy and hard to follow and a little bit scary, just like the television show, but we are now coming out of that and we have new leadership showing up. So I'm very optimistic that we're going to see not just a different direction, obviously, and as Jan said and others said, a lot of administrative actions and executive actions that will help turn things in the right direction. But I have a different optimism, which is that, and I know a lot of people on this panel have experienced this, and Jan made reference to it too. I think there are a lot of Republicans, and I think there are a lot of conservatives and just Americans who are deeply concerned about climate. This does not need to be a partisan issue, and every single day it becomes less and less a partisan issue. There has been a blocking factor out of the White House in the last 4 years that has made it partisan more, again, making masks partisan, making truth and science and all these things partisan, but that's not really what most Americans want by a long shot. And the thing about climate is that, you know, there are people who deny it and believe in it. But the people who deny it, that number is getting smaller, by the hour. And they don't go back. No one like round trips on a climate stance. They don't say like, oh, actually, now that I think about it, it's not really a thing. So we're seeing, I think, the beginning of what should be a wave of, just people acknowledging the perspective they had. Maybe they come at it from a conservation standpoint, or a hunting and a land use standpoint, or just preservation of, say, all of South Florida, or whatever angle they're going to bring to it. I think we're going to see a lot of people politically on the other side, or whatever, as a Republican or different parties, come together and say, you know what, it's okay. Climate is okay. And maybe they'll take a jobs angle first, with wind jobs all over the country, with biomass in the Southeast, with solar now pretty much everywhere in massive numbers. But there are so many different angles that they can use to hook onto it. So I'm optimistic that we're not just going to see great efforts out of the Biden administration and all the terrific people that have been out at Castle Black, who he brings in to help change the entire course from an administrative standpoint. But I think we're going to see it also in Congress and the Senate. And it doesn't take that many in either of those two chambers to make a massive difference. I would also say, of course, for anyone watching, if you're interested in still affecting that outcome, Georgia has a lot of work to do. So Clean Energy for Biden is a group that's going to do a lot of work there. There are tons of people doing it. And I think this really isn't over in terms of creating a wave of opportunity versus creating a slower but gradual and positive sense of opportunity. So from a venture standpoint, I'll just say, Obvious Ventures is a 7-year-old venture fund. We invest in mission-driven founders trying to transform trillion-dollar industries. Venture's a long game. So our investors and media and entrepreneurs asked us when Trump got elected, what does this mean for world positive investments? What does this mean for energy and mobility? And our view then is the same as it is now, which is that these are issues that take decades to come about, and the transformations happen regardless of who is occupying the Oval Office. And in fact, after Trump came into office, we saw just a blossoming of innovation. And because of leadership like David's at the CEC and the Elemental Accelerator, these organizations stepped in to fill some of the gaps on funding and jumpstarting businesses, and then supporting policies that could really transform industries. So that will continue. But for all the entrepreneurs on the, climate entrepreneurs in the audience, I would say that it's go time, right? Like there has not been a better setup. Not only does the world need us more than ever, but you will have government support, and you're going to have a lot of financial support from folks like Obvious. We've been doing this a while, and we're seeing more and more people coming into the space over the last 4 years, despite who was in the White House. But I think with the signaling you'll get from the White House, and everyone being, again, allowed to admit that climate is a massive and real issue, regardless of where you are in the political spectrum, I think you're going to see a flood of capital. So I was a climate entrepreneur in 2003, starting a solar company, and it was slim pickings raising money. And about 6 years later, there was a clean tech 1.0 rush of capital, and then some of that capital dried up. And what I would say is, there are times when there's a lot of capital, and there are times when things are a little bit tighter. I think in the next couple of years, you're going to see a flooding of capital into this space. And 2021 in particular is going to see a real influx in terms of helping to create businesses. And to those founders, I would just say that don't confuse the availability of capital with pursuit, with the opportunity to just pursue massive ideas with wild abandon. I think staying disciplined as if the capital was really tight is going to be very helpful. We look at what we call low Maslow pyramid kind of opportunities in energy, in food, in mobility. And across those, I would just highlight a couple. We're very, energy, I would say in the last 20 years, as David and others referenced, has seen an incredible cost reduction that has now, in my opinion, left a lot of the rollout and financing to the world of big businesses. Companies like NextEra, where I used to work, are now the largest wind and solar developers in the world. And that's great. That's not really a venture scale opportunity, But in places like mobility or energy storage, where there's still a lot more work to be done, I think there's an incredible amount of opportunities. Anything transitioning to an all electric world, and as was mentioned, with cross-laminated timber and other things, steel or concrete moving to an electric solution where you can completely decarbonize those processes, we think that those are going to be incredible opportunities. I think we could look at the same on the food front. We were early investors in Beyond Meat, but there's plenty of other opportunities to take a lot of carbon out while finding better and better ways to bring nutrition and not just calories to the world in a cost-effective manner. And then there's sort of frontier tech around climate, very, very specifically going after CO2. And I think there's a lot of work left to be done. It's very early, and I'm looking forward to having national labs, even though they've done a great job with what they had in the last 4 years, hopefully being even more empowered to push more money towards decarbonization and open air capture and technologies like that. And then I share with Carl a strong passion for the ocean. So looking for ways to de-acidify the ocean, but also just basic processes like aquaculture. If we can find ways to make aquaculture a lot less environmentally impactful, we're going to find solutions that are going to bring a much healthier and more vibrant ecosystem as it battles some of the acidification. So that's broad strokes what we're excited about. I loved what Nneka said about every company becoming a climate company. 25 years ago, when I started a company in the internet space, we were all called something.com, and we had to explain to people, well, that's because we want you to know where we're located. Amazon actually started as Amazon.com. They and we and everybody else dropped the .com in the mid-aughts because everybody knew that you're just an internet company. Everyone is an internet company. I feel the same way about climate. I think as Amazon itself has proven, it has no choice. It has to be a climate company. Microsoft is becoming a climate company. So I think there's a great opportunity for everybody to embed climate in every kind of company that they build.
Yeah, I think that's a great closing note. I wanted to ask Richard Chan if there was one question perhaps that we could turn to. He's been monitoring the questions, and we're almost at a time right now. Richard, is there one question we could ask the panelists to comment on?
Yeah, I think the very last question has not been addressed, but what are some of the panelists' thoughts on carbon credits, and would they be useful for this particular effort? So Grant, I will let you choose a panelist who you think can answer that question.
Who wants to take that one on? Jan?
I'd love to take that one on. Yeah, on the carbon crediting question, I have had a very long experience, most recently working at the California Air Resources Board on the use of carbon offsets. And I think that they have diminishing marginal returns for a number of different reasons. The most obvious one is that we saw a bunch of those offsets go up in smoke recently in the catastrophic fires that we experienced here in California. So on the natural side, I think the permanence question and the reversal threat lead to very, very onerous transactions costs around trying to guarantee the permanence of that sink source. So that's the first piece. Second piece is I know that the Biden administration is not going to be leading with a price on carbon. If they go, they're going to use a clean energy standard or some sort of other mechanism. And for those of you who go back, who are has-beens like me, you'll know that an offset was invented to be a complement to a cap and trade system. It's a deeply discounted instrument because the monitoring and verification is so unsound. And so it kind of helps to serve as a cost containment mechanism under a cap and trade system. But here in California, forced offsets were trading at the same price as allowances because of the onerous transactions cost. I think we've also learned here in California in particular that offsets are fraught because there is the concern that they will lead to disproportionate increases of conventional air pollutants and toxics in at-risk communities. So I think that if we are at the national level going to be thinking about an agenda focused very squarely on equity and justice. And I'll say my late dissertation advisor wrote the Clinton executive order on environmental justice. And I'm so delighted to see that elevated again in a Biden administration. But I think that offsets are a losing proposition in that regard as well. And then finally, although I know that C-suites are looking for cost-effective ways to think about reversing their historic emissions, I think for all of the reasons I've just mentioned, offsets are not the way to go. Carbon removal is expensive and keeping an existing forest standing is not the same as reforestation and afforestation. There are going to be incremental costs associated with those things that are not commensurate with a traditional offset. And so I am somewhat distressed by all of the protocol development activity that we see going on everywhere, because while that creates a path to penance for cap and trade, you're not going to get around the fact that if you build a marginal abatement curve that includes carbon dioxide removal, it's going to be the high end or the ceiling of that marginal abatement curve and not something cheap that one could credibly frame as an offset. Sorry for the long-winded response, but it's
No,
me.
That's helpful. That's helpful, I think. Well, everybody, I want to thank you. Carl, did you want to touch on and say a final word?
Well, I mean, her comments were perfect, but in the simpler terms, carbon credits may slant the playing field slightly towards clean energy, but it's kind of a banking and lawyer solution to an engineering problem. What we need is teams that can run uphill. We need to make energy cheaper, and that has a much better effect on economic empowerment, because when energy gets cheaper, businesses become more competitive, there's automatically more jobs, and people have a better lifestyle, and more access to air conditioning, clean food and water. Water becomes a non-problem. So we need to focus on the most important sub-goal: cheap, clean energy. If California had spent its WAD that it spent on renewable energy, partly on nuclear, we would already be at zero emissions and on our way down. But because we zeroed out nuclear, of course, we couldn't help with industry, and we are only halfway where we should be. So,
great. Well, thank you, everyone. And Andrew, Becca, Carl, Josh, Jan, and Richard. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for joining us, Changemakers. I hope this inspired you. Thank you for all the questions. And that's a wrap.
Thank you.